The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. For Joseph Pearce, Vivian Dudro, and I continue to discuss Father Robert Spitzer's book, Science at the Doorstep to God, who takes a very comprehensive approach. His idea, based on his quote of Newman, is that different kinds of proof may have varying levels of persuasiveness, but when all sorts of evidence from different spheres points in the same direction, it makes things more likely, and so if you go to the table of contents, which is on an unnumbered page, way unnumbered page, 13, 11, I don't know, 9 or something like that, we've chapter 1 had to do with the beginning of the universe, and the question is, does science point to the beginning of our universe? And all the scientific evidence points to the answer being yes to that. Chapter 2, does fine-tuning for life point to transcendent intelligence? Again, the scientific evidence is overwhelming for that. Then chapter 3, is theism more rational than atheism? That's a philosophic approach. Chapter 4, which we're now going to begin, is there medical and scientific evidence of a transcendent soul? He's now going to talk about experiences of, near death and clinical death and terminal lucidity and so on. So let's jump into that. And I'm happy to have someone else begin the comments on that. Page 121, I believe.
Well, I mean, the actual section 1 at the beginning sets the scene with that introduction subsection there with the 3 sections of the chapter he's going to cover one after the other. So perhaps if we just read that, then we've got the whole picture in our minds as we move forward. So it says, in this and the 2 next chapters, we will present 9 kinds of evidence for a transcendent soul manifesting several transphysical activities. In this chapter, we explore 3 of those kinds of evidence. 1, peer-reviewed medical studies of near-death experiences indicating a transphysical soul. That's section 1. 2, medical studies of terminal lucidity indicating consciousness beyond the brain. That's section 2A. And then 3, medical studies of intelligence in severely hydrocephalic patients indicating intelligence beyond the brain, section 2B. So, this is very much his methodical approach to tell us what he's going to do and then do it, and also remind us he's doing it as he's doing it. It's very, it's very much a methodical approach to teaching us, which is helpful if somewhat repetitive.
I would just like to add that a woman I know who used to teach anatomy at UC Medical School here in San Francisco, she mentioned to me that the study of consciousness, what is it? What is the brain? She said, this is cutting edge science right now. This is a big topic of study, which I didn't know. I mean, I had known that there were the kinds of stories that he tells. I had heard some of these things, but I didn't realize that there was actually, in non-religious contexts, let's just call it that, a very keen interest in studying this. So I'm just throwing that out there.
There's a distinction between the brain as the mechanism and the mind as the
yes.
brain being the machine by which the mind can be felt, understood, related to others. And so the science knows very little about the machine, but the machine isn't the same thing as the mind, and we obviously need to keep that distinct.
And parenthetically, because of an article you, Joseph, wrote recently, which I did not read yet, in which you praised E.F. Schumacher for his books, A Guide for the Perplexed and Small is Beautiful, we were considering putting those in our Ignatius Press bookshelf. That is, books we sell, that we buy from other publishers. So I read for the first time a shorter one, which is The Guide for the Perplexed by E.F. Schumacher. And I think his approach is extremely important in this question of consciousness. And I think it's irrefutable or irrefutable. How do you say that? Anyway, okay.
Ask the Englishman.
Yeah. How do you say it?
I say irrefutable, so you can say the opposite, Father.
Irrefutable?
I say
Like
irrefutable.
Okay, irrefutable. All right. But so, I mean, he talks about the levels of being, mineral, plant, animal, and rational, and so on. And then about being adequate to know or to understand those levels, and that you can't understand. He gives the example of a book. Of course, the book is a physical object. We can know that, but for us, it's just colors, and it's just black marks, on light-colored paper. And for an animal as well, it might sniff it or might taste it or whatever, but there's meaning there. But if you're not adequate to the meaning, all it is for you is something on a lower level. So he approaches consciousness that way too. So I recommend that book, and we're probably going to put it in our bookshelf on our catalog. But like as you say, it's a question. It's got to be always present, because there is no scientific answer to the question of what is life, what is consciousness, what is self-awareness, because science is dealing with the material world. It has no sensory perception. It has no perception of those higher levels.
Well, where does this book talk about the study with different primates?
I think it's the next chapter. I think it's the next chapter.
Right, and
or the next section, perhaps. No, the next chapter, I think.
Yeah. So I mean, that to me is fascinating, because to explain this leap between human beings and even very intelligent species of animals. And it's another one of these missing links, like the leap is so, and the studies that have been done with language and primates demonstrates just how huge this gap of understanding is. The difference between manipulating a physical object.
He talks later about, is it Noam Chomsky, the linguist, proving that the Darwinian evolutionary understanding of language is completely false, basically.
Yes. So that's coming later. So, but it's related to Schumacher here, so that's why.
Right. So section 1, as you mentioned, Joseph, is studies of near-death experiences. So even though these things are in some sense persuasive, I'm always skeptical about them. To me, the philosophical arguments are much more compelling. But
it begs further questions. But I mean, at the top of page 128, I do find it intriguing that he says here the above findings. He obviously gives these medical peer-reviewed studies and the evidence. The above findings are almost universal, and no peer-reviewed study deviates significantly from them. As additional peer-reviewed studies are carried out, the preponderance of evidence supporting consciousness after clinical death is likely to increase, and perhaps one day meet the high standards of absolute proof. But the problem of absolute proof, I agree, that's a different issue. But I think that the other questions that are begged by this is we don't really know. We don't really know what. We've defined death as if the brain is not functioning, right? So we see that the brain's not functioning, therefore the person's died. But it's possible that life continues somehow or other following the death of the brain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's out of the body. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, I don't know. I'm shooting in the dark here, but it's just that I think because we are so ignorant and there are so many missing pieces of the puzzle, it's very easy and tempting to start painting our own pictures in the place of the missing pieces. And I think that's when you've got something which is pioneering studies, there's so much we don't know, it becomes dangerous that we start leaping to conclusions.
Is it not true that your fingernails keep growing and your hair a bit after you die?
Yeah.
So things happen. I want to say a word on so-called peer-reviewed studies. Now, the concept is important because obviously, if someone is writing about nuclear physics, about which we know very little, I can't judge if the article or the study is good or not. But someone else who's an expert in nuclear physics can do so. And that's what peer review means. However, there's so much economic pressure and other kinds of pressures that now peer reviewed means get some friends to support your study, you know? It doesn't.
Yes.
So just the fact that it's peer reviewed is not as convincing to me as it once was. I want to know who the peers were and what conflicts of interest they might have had.
Right. It's like when I'm editing a manuscript and I send the corrections back to the author and he says, well, my wife loved it.
Yeah.
Good on her. Okay. But I did want to say, though, that these near-death experiences, to me, the most amazing one is people born blind reporting that in their near-death out-of-body experience, they saw the operating room and things like this when they have no memory for that from a sighted experience. I as I was reading that, I thought, what the dickens? How do you explain that?
Yeah.
That someone born blind saw the operating room.
I mean, at the very, very least, this is eyebrow raising and forcing people to get out of their arrogant presuppositions, particularly from the point of view of materialists. And I would say one about peer review, and I agree with you, Father. Once, I mean, I don't have all the details here. I'm suspecting these are scientific, medical, so scientific. So the peer review would be coming presumably from a position of skepticism, scientific method. In other words, not loony people that are trying to prove that there is after death experience. On the contrary, one would presume, if it's a medical study, that they're trying to find rational reasons, and the last thing they're looking for is as a miraculous possibility, because that's outside the domain of the medical peer-reviewed studies. So, if anything, the fact that it's peer-reviewed does err on the side of a skepticism towards the approach rather than a gullibility towards the approach.
Well, they might, but after our COVID experience of peer-reviewed studies on both sides, I'm saying, hey, they can't agree. How am I supposed to decide?
Yeah.
But for certain, I would say it reminds us of the enigmatic character or mysterious character of human consciousness and human life. At the very least, we can say this is something we have to puzzle over. At the same time, if you're committed to a belief that there's no God, you will try to find any explanation, no matter how convoluted. And it's like evolution. I mean, trying to explain what the mechanism is by which chance and natural selection could have arrived at these complex mechanisms, very hard. Reminds me of the transition from Ptolemaic to Copernican astronomy. For Ptolemy, the Earth was the center, and they had the planets were going around the Earth, and the sun is going around the Earth, and they can predict things with tremendous accuracy. Well, as a telescope, people begin to see more and more. They say, wait a minute, the orbit isn't perfect, and so they say, well, there's an epicycle. The sun's orbit, is a perfect circle, but around that orbit, there's an epicycle that goes around the cycle, and that's what causes the sun to have these movements. Well, pretty soon it got more accurate. They had epicycles and epicycles, and so I tell my strict Thomist friends, like the great Steve Long, who tries to explain things with wire drawn, precision, with careful. I said, Steve, forget the epicycles. Let's just have a Occam's razor and have a simple explanation. So likewise here, as they try to explain the beginning of the universe, they try to explain fine tuning, they try to explain after experiences, they come up with more and more complicated epicyclical, I would say, theories. And a normal person says, wait a minute, why are you fighting why are you going against the goat here?
Yeah.
Just open your eyes.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for indulging my reflections there. So is that enough on near death?
Yeah, I mean, he obviously gives lots of case studies, and people that read the book can see them for themselves. I don't think we necessarily have to go through and look at them all. So yeah.
Okay. So in that section is
Oh, I wanted to point out one thing, that in addition to was I surprised about blind people having apparently sight after death, it was also interesting to note that some of these near-death experiences are harrowing experiences.
Yes.
I had only heard of the tunnel of light
yeah.
and the happy, good feelings and all this kind of thing. This was the first I'd ever read that some of these experiences are not, that they're harrowing experiences. And so, anyway, I just throw that out there as, if you thought theoretically that, oh, well, people say they've read about these experiences that other people have had, and now they are, there's a form of imitation that you're not even conscious that you're imitating something, right? That you're not conscious but for people to have different kinds of experiences, right? That to me is a little point that argues for, wow, something really is happening that's beyond a physical explanation.
Yeah, and also it avoids the danger of that everybody's going to have a wonderful experience when they die. There's no such thing as hell or purgatory, no suffering after death. That basically there's a happy ending for everything. Do what you like, basically, because there's a happy ending for all of us when we die. That light's awaiting all of us. Well, the fact that 15% plus are having hellish experiences in their near-death experience, after-death experience, whatever, suggests that it's not quite as simple as that.
Right.
So page 140, section 2, medical studies of terminal lucidity and hydrocephalic intelligence. Part A is terminal lucidity, and he describes it. May be described as follows. Patients with severe neurological disorders, skipping a bit, who suddenly awake to consciousness and significant cognitive activity prior to death. There are two types, gradual and rapid. So that's what he's going to discuss here. I mean, studies on this.
And I have heard from my own experience of people I know or whatever, I have heard stories of people near death thinking they were in a coma, thinking they were, and suddenly this person has a moment of, like he says, lucidity, that everyone in the room witnesses just prior to the person dying. In fact, a very touching story was about a priest I knew, and I was not there at his death, but I heard the story later. And he
became lucid before he died?
Well, what he did was...
That happens to me.
Yeah, maybe not. I don't know. That depends. But anyway, the man was presumed to be in a coma, but he was definitely in some kind of struggle at the same. How can you both be in a coma and be in some kind of struggle at the same time? And his superior entered the room. He was in a religious order, this priest. And he called him by his first name, Joseph or whatever. He said, "You can let go now." And he's still agitated, whatever. And his superior says, "I order you to let go now. You need to obey." Boom. So, what's going on? That's just one story out of many that I've heard. What is going on with, you think this person's already gone, not hearing, not understanding, and there's all these kinds of experiences that have been documented.
Well, let me interject another sidebar. I don't believe you mentioned this here, but you've heard this expression, quote, persistent vegetative state, close quotes.
Right.
I think that's an abominable expression.
Yes.
You're not a vegetable when you're asleep, And as you say, we don't know what's going on inside.
We don't.
And you're not a vegetable. So you don't call it, it's not a vegetative state. It's a state of a human coma or being asleep or something like that.
That's right.
But the difficulty is if you call it a persistent vegetative state, well, of course, nothing wrong with cutting them with a carrot, right?
That's right.
Exactly.
So we say goodbye.
And again, there has been evidence of people that have been in that so-called vegetative state who could hear. They couldn't communicate, but they could hear whatever we were saying around them. They're completely lucid. They're just incommunicative.
Yes.
You know,
That's
that's not a vegetable.
Well, maybe potatoes, they just can't talk, you know. They're
You think about that. You think about next time you're peeling a potato, Father. Think about it, okay?
all right.
Must I?
So that concludes chapter 4. Why don't we take a break here for this session? What do you think about that?
Sounds good.
Let's start with chapter 5. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you for chapter 5 in the next session.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.